Afternoon all. Let's continue the evolution of style series by looking at game 18. This is a very special and funny game for me actually, because as many of you know from many live commentary games, I've been playing the burn variation with black and the Morozevich line in particular. So Alexander Alekhine plays the French defence, and he plays the line I've been playing a lot. After knight f6, bishop g5, he takes on e4 and plays bishop e7. Okay, nothing unusual so far. Efim as white takes on f6, presumably expecting the standard continuation. Bishop takes f6, where white enjoys a small edge, although white gives up the dark square bishop. Moves like knight f3, c3 to support d4, bishop d3, maybe queen e2, all quite natural moves which might give white a small edge. The dynamic way of playing it, incurring a structural damage, is g takes f6, and that's what Alexander plays. So he's playing the Morozevich line of the burn variation, which of course Alexander Morozevich was one of the strong grandmasters using this line. But previously to that, Anderson was another GM using this line. Okay, so after knight f3, there's a very early f5, which is also interesting actually. Magnus in Blitz, I think, recently has played a quick f5 and c5. Or was it Nakamura? One of the two had played for quick f5 and c5 to try and basically use the bishop quicker than usual. Maybe on this diagonal, put immediate pressure on d4 quicker. So where does the knight go? Well, Efim actually plays knight c3, which, you know, maybe here knight g3 is a good alternative, because if knight g3, then the strategic break of later, you know, playing not in this particular position, in this exact position, c4 and d5 in principle. Because in this particular position there's bishop b4 to parry, but you know, say queen d2, you know, then castle queenside, then c4 and d5 could be an important strategic break. So with knight c3, white's blocking in the c pawn, but on the other hand, given that black's done that quick f5, e5 is already a bit weaker. So if you can get a bind on the e5 square, that would be interesting. Just for white to get a small advantage. Doesn't need necessarily to play for c4 and d5. So c6 puts the brakes on a future d5, vacates c7, which is what I often do for a queen coming to c7. But I've borrowed as black my strategy from Anderson, just playing b6, bishop b, you know, to b7, knight d7, try and castle queenside, and use the g file if white dares to castle kingside. White does neutralise the, you know, the counterplay on the g file in advance, sort of prophylaxis. g3, not putting the bishop on the conventional kind of squares, but fianchettoing it here, neutralising that g file pressure in advance. So knight d7, bishop g2, and now queen c7. So the only unusual thing which varies from my usual blitz play is this quick f5, which I would say is a bit risky because of the e5 issue. If white can get a bind on e5, sometimes it's nice to have that, you know, pawn on f6 still there, keeping hold of the e5 square. White exerts more pressure on e5 now with queen e2. So okay, if black tries to castle queenside, you know, usually I just play this myself, but here with e5 weakened, you know, white could actually just castle rook e1 and knight e5 and just enjoy a nagging, annoying knight. If it's ever dislodged with f6, then e6 is going to be weaker, you know, as a consequence. But there's another energetic pawn move played by Alexander here, b5, which at first seems a bit dodgy because of this fianchetto bishop on the diagonal. Knight e5 is going to threaten things like knight b5 because of the bishop, you know, on a8. But after knight e5, actually bishop b7 parries that immediate kind of threat without having to take on e5. If he did take on e5, then maybe, you know, d takes e, and then the d file is going to be important for white. So here white's castled, And okay, if knight e5 d takes, then black can't even castle there. This next move has some advantages, knight b6, and it's a maneuver I'd often use as well, just to get in either on c4 or d5. What's the downside of this? The thing is, the pressure's been released off e5, which means now the knight's kind of useful for attacking f7 in a coordinated fashion with other pieces now, without that threat of it being exchanged off. So queen h5 uses that, so this is nice play from Efim so far. And now Alexander plays a typical pawn sack that I would use. The h7 pawn is sacked, but it dares not to be taken here by white. White instead consolidates his e5 control. He doesn't take that pawn, and it would be a little bit risky. Black would be getting some queenside counterplay if the pawn was taken, and I'll show you with this example variation. If queen takes, castle queenside, and here actually we see the tactic knight f7, rook takes, queen takes, bishop g5 check would win the queen. So that's not on. Okay, so say we have a continuation like this, with black gaining a little bit of play, because once that knight's dislodged from c3, then c5 is more effective, and also this a file could potentially be a way to get to the white king. So especially if that goes with tempo, the king b7, then after rook a8 black would have counterplay being generated. But this is all avoided. White isn't too greedy here. He plays a move which plays on black's early f5 basically. He increases that bind on the e5 square. He plays f4. So great move, f4. It also cuts out this diagonal from the bishop g5 checks. It will no longer be check, which means f7 would be on. If black castle queenside, knight takes f7 is now on. So actually Alexander played b4, attacking the knight, and now knight d5. Okay, so it seems, black might be generating or trying to generate some, counterplay against the white king, maybe leave the rook on a8 even potentially. But here, another great move actually, which shows great foresight and hijacking actually a lot of the squares, and especially c5, believe it or not, could actually be significant. If white can peel open that c file, c5 is going to be a great square to use. For a knight especially, and this is what happens in the game. White's first move is really very powerful. Bishop takes d5, it's reducing black's dynamism, and now king b1, this king shuffle to prepare a ripping open of the c file. Remember that c5 square? It's going to be a major liability. We've still got this huge knight on e5 here. So a5, the problem with all these pawn moves is the vacuum it sometimes creates. These vacuum squares are all left behind by the pawn moves. And if black's not able to quickly generate the open lines, there could be some backfire on simply, squares like c5 positionally. As many of my blitz game shows, especially against type players, c5 is often sort of, if that's controlled by white, it often spells the end of the game actually. But there's a very, very powerful move here played. Even though black is not castling queenside, white can still carry on a pawn structure operation, and he does so energetically here with the move g4. So the queen is actually now putting great pressure on f5. Black takes, and now f5. And now here this is getting extremely problematic. This pinned pawn is now a problem with f takes e6 on the cards. So Alexander, he takes on f5 and plays a4. So he's carrying on with his queenside attack as if the rook might be useful on a8. Rook he1, and there's kind of ominous threats here on the cards. a3, not really opening lines now because the lines are kept closed with b3. Okay, so if white can just rip open and make use of that b4 pawn, this whole file, c file, can be hijacked, and especially c5 can be made use of. No entry point at the moment. This knight's keeping out the queen from c3. So bishop c8, and now white does nab this h7 pawn, not fearing the counterplay. It's being shut down a bit. Black shut down his own counterplay. So Alexander's being a bit positionally outplayed. It's a 2 bishops versus 2 knights scenario. but with white able to get very, very good squares on c5 and e5 in this game. So bishop e6, queen d3, coming back to the centre, introducing threats like queen b5 check. Black now actually castles queenside finally. Okay, but now c3, ripping open that c file. The king and queen are not ideally positioned. Once a rook c1 happens, that's going to be a nasty skewer. So king b7, rook c1, again threatening c takes b4, immediately attacking the queen. The queen has to get out of the way. It's all pretty nasty. C takes b4, bishop takes b4, and now look at white's powerful knight on e5 is able to support a quick accelerated doubling of rooks with rook c6. So the rooks are now doubled on the c file, and it's a very dangerous situation for black. He plays rook c8, seemingly parrying the major threats, but now knight f4 is played. So knight f4, putting pressure on e6 and d5. Bishop d6, and now knight takes e6. So what's happening here after knight takes e6? One of the big problems about black taking with fe is that the second rank is also exposed to queen h7 check. That's the big deal about this. One of the big deals. Okay, so f takes queen h7 check, and it's very difficult for black to defend this. In fact, technically he's busted here. He plays rook c7 after check, which is the correct move. A slightly inaccurate move from Efim. He could have blown Alexander away with simply getting into that c5 square with the immediate knight d3. Seems technically absolutely crushing. For example, queen b6, rook takes c7, check, check, and look at how the rook and king are very unfortunate for a fork here after knight takes e6, winning easily because this pawn's not a threat. So that wasn't played though. There's no real defense, believe it or not, to knight d3 here. This move knight d3 is the most crushing possibility. If we try say king b8, then knight c5 with numerous threats, knight d7 check, and if the queen ever moves, there's knight a6, for example, queen d2. Okay, threatening mate, but check. It all runs with check, check, and that's crushing. The queen can always go back to c2 to stave off the mate threat on b2. So this knight d3 is really crushing, but queen d7 is played, and after queen b6, now the knight comes to d3 for that decisive knight c5. This is the downside of black's pawn moves on the queen side quite often. It's a simple square like c5 which can lead to black's downfall, and it looks a bit like hijacking, and it shouldn't have happened because it's cheeky, as if black's made all the work. But if all the work consists of pawn moves leave a vacuum, of square weaknesses behind them. So that's kind of controversial work, exposing weaknesses, creating weaknesses for future exploitation. So there's a big weakness on c5 here. After rook d8, a beautiful tactical blow, similar in the pattern to what I've just previously shown you. I wonder if you can spot it. If I give you 10 seconds here, what would you play in this position? 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, rook takes c7 check. So again, this nasty knight c5 check, and again the king and rook are unfortunately placed for a fork, and this happened, all this happened, and now white has a winning king and pawn endgame, because this pawn is actually a liability. The poor goal hanger pawn can be a total losing liability in the endgame, as this shows just b4, and it's going to be munched. Black king is far too far away to do anything about that. So two connected pass pawns, it's resignable, but b5 just makes sure that's all that's needed to win. It makes sure that black's pawn's not going anywhere. The king is distracted back, and a few more moves, and Alexander kicks in. He resigns here, throws in the towel. So it was interesting to see this burn variation. As far as the evolution of style, these dynamic strategies, they needed quite high precision. I think the early F5 is a little bit controversial in my view. I don't know what you guys think, but the early F5 seems a bit overly ambitious because it's useful on F6 quite often to make sure knight E5s are not so powerful, and that knight was extremely powerful in this game, so that's a good reason for delaying the use of F5. But in this early game, you know, maybe this is not very trodden territory. It's kind of new opening explorations at a high level of a world championship match. The early F5 was played. Okay, so knight C3, not minding the suppressing of the C pawn, which might have been useful for C4 and D5, which is a sort of thematic break to blow up black's pawn structure, you know, leaving with diced pawns if ED. But knight C3, he's got the E5 square and he is neutralizing the G file pressure, so it's being played in a sort of very modern way by white, actually, suppressing black's you know, dynamic trump cards, using that E5 square quite nicely. Now there's, after this also quite ambitious B5 move, there's more liabilities, because B6, a pawn on B6 would also of course support the C5 square, which was another, it ended up being a losing liability, black's lack of control of C5. So C5 and E5 are the controversies, you know, created by the early F5s and B5s in this game. But it takes some time for that to become apparent. It takes some peeling actions from white to expose that C file and really highlight the weakness of the C5 square here. But this bishop takes D5 is a great prelude to that, to reducing black's dynamism. Now this king shuffle to be able to play rook C1 and, you know, break open that C file. But first, this strategic operation with G4 and F5 is also, you know, excellent stuff. This was an exceptionally powerful game, I believe, played by Efim against this system as black. It seems he really did want to punish Alexander for his perhaps overly creative play and aggressive looking pawn moves. And, you know, it's very nice thematic ideas being played out here. Peeling open soon the C file, keeping the files locked, you know, after A3, B3, for that C3 to be a very powerful move coming up soon. And that C file spells disaster for the black king, essentially. But another nice spot was this knight F4 E6 idea to get access to the second rank. That's another beautiful aspect of the game here, as well as the C file. You know, taking these roads into account is sign of a good, you know, very nice attacking player. So in his elements, given the good position, it would seem F in many ways was a worthy challenger. But even so, of course, Capo should have had, you know, the match instead. But financial constraints and tit for tat came in, you know, for matching the conditions, you know, set by Alexander. But this was a fantastic game, though, played by white, punishing Alexander's not so solid system. So knight takes E6, brutal punishments, coming to use that second row. And just an unfortunate situation in many variations with the king and the rook now. So knight d3 seems immediately kind of decisive here. But this move is also strong, queen d7. And now after knight d3 it's crushing anyway. And so the final combination. I wonder after queen d7 what black's best move would have been. And what is the evaluation here? I think it's still very bad for black, but not so bad. Queen b6, so knight d3 here, king b8, again this is kind of dangerous for the black king, rook c6, rook c5. It seems, you know, the bishop's quite helpless here actually, and black could end up losing the queen like this. Okay, so this is a very dangerous position, lots of holes to exploit here. And it was a neat combination to finish off the positional play by Efim. So brilliant game by white in this match. Sort of ahead of its time in the way dynamism was suppressed. These methods of fianchettoing the bishop against that G file the peeling of the file, the locking down of the lines. It was played in a modern thematic way. Also 96 for the second row access was also kind of cool. There were many cool aspects to this game. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.